Hi, it's Ileana at Awakening Cosmic Reality Show, and I have Daniel Sala with me today, and we're going to be discussing Radu Cinamar's books 6 and 7. Daniel, can you please tell us the names of the books?
Yeah, sure. The sixth is Forgotten Genesis, and the seventh is Etheric Crystal, and under that is the third tunnel. So
Excellent. How have you been?
not bad. I can't complain. Yeah, I still pushing my little disclosure efforts, and we started this, so it's only natural that we finish it. Although the series itself, it's far from over, but this is all we have so far.
Okay, yeah, so let's get into the discussion of book 6.
Of course. Yeah, and also, I wanted to say that it's a shame that so far it's only been translated into two languages that I know of, which are English and Dutch, the sixth and seventh. That's, as it turns out, it comes from very high echelons, and it's supposed to be more widespread. So that's why it's fun to contribute to that alongside you. And so the sixth book deals with the history of humanity, but in the most credible and down to earth and obvious way that I've ever encountered by far. And it details how there was the only one tunnel left that hadn't been explored by Radu Cinamar, and that was the one to Tibet, which went to the Iraq chamber. And that also housed a cold room similar to the one under Egypt. But the trouble is that from their previous expeditions there by Cesar, they had trouble manning the chair that was in that room because it simply wouldn't start. And that was atypical because usually all the technology eventually was well interpreted by the Romanian. This chair apparently had a component in the form of a crystal that wasn't located. And this is where the technology that is the basis of the entirety of the sixth book comes in, because at one point it's noticed in the crystal tablets that they watched from Egypt that in as a sort of artifact there was in a corner a chair, and next to it was a lit up crystal, and this chair had the exact shape as the one in Iraq. And so this led them to believe that the missing component is that crystal that was next to it. And in order to find it, Cesar thought of contacting Drin, their go-between for one of the interterrestrial cities, and he suggested that they went to Apelos because Apelos was a city that had not just stations but hybridized stations with more than one ET. They were sort of experiment, but not like lab rats or anything, just an evolved one. And because of this, their affiliation with ET technology, they were better equipped to determine why the crystal was absent for them. So, by the way, during this little exchange with Drin, he finds out that Radu made a good impression on the Apelos people, and so they wanted him to act as their liaison from here on out. And that the wise men, the council in Apelos, also decided that it was a good idea to show Radu one of their advanced holographic displays technologies that he only got a glimpse of before. He offered him two very extensive sessions with it in order to give him material for a book that would describe this history of humanity. And their gift that really blew Radu away to him was a pair of goggles, but really to just look like sunglasses, but they were not opaque. They were see-through, and they had a couple of appendixes that it allowed him to see with four-dimensional overlays, and they would enhance his perception, and the colors would become more vivid and sharp as well, the image in general. And the other feature, which was on the other side, which you could start at any time, was a sort of replay or playback mode. So the instant you put those goggles on, it would record everything that you ever did, and even down to the emotions. And you could relive that by simply thinking of that event or what have you. Then you would still have the consciousness of your day-to-day life, but you would see your previous experiences in perfect quality. And whenever you have this decision coming from a high council from the inner earth, this also means that it was sanctioned by the one above it, which is in Shambhala. So in other words, you have a very refined and evolved beings that want us to have this knowledge. So then he was brought, Radu, to this above ground, actually, hangar that belonged to the Apelos civilization. And before that, he had to meet with someone overground in an undisclosed location outside of a town. So, and at the minute he met him, his phone got scrambled. It wouldn't even turn on. This was just a hint of their technology. And he got led into this hangar, which actually just looked like a run-of-the-mill warehouse, and into a smaller room where there were only a couple of armchairs and just a foldable TV, and it was silver, and it came out of the ground. It was rectangle shaped, but it emerged up, and it projected a 1.5 meter by 1 meter hologram, and it was quite deep as well, I think half a meter, which also had perfect quality. And in combination with the goggles that I mentioned, it was pretty much like you were inside whatever you were looking at. And the Apelos people actually tended to use it just to explore the neighboring town, which they would sometimes trade with, and also for security reasons. The first hologram was only this, and then he showed him the section of the earth which I briefly described in our last episode. And then he quickly got an intro to the mechanism of this Akashic field tapping device, actually. So it presented just an objective account of anything, and it would be led only by the user and by telepathy, just by thought. And of course, it was meant to be used in concert with the goggles. And whenever you exhibited unclear thoughts, or just your chain of thoughts stopped altogether, it would blur out and possibly even freeze. And this was a problem at first for Radu. It took him a while to get used to it, but eventually, with the help of the Apelos guy that was sitting next to him on the armchair, he got more and more skilled with it. And a short, interesting conversation before they got to explore the Akashic field records. The explorers of the third tunnel, which we'll get to in book 7, were involved in a conversation between Radu and Cesar, and in it, Cesar pointed out that Noah's Ark was not what we thought. It was actually, real. There was a Noah and who lived longer than the average, and however, his ark was much less impressive and housed much fewer pairs of species. It was more or less a good faith try by the humans, like a gesture, that the real library was collected by an ET civilization, and they left no stone unturned. And it was thanks to them that the flora and fauna was replenished after that flood, which, by the way, did not cover the entirety of the Earth. So just a local, of course. So yeah, now we'll start on the visions that were controlled by his device. And of course, we all know that the theory of evolution is not complete, that we didn't just make a transformation from monkeys unaltered, unaided by anything else. That also creationism is not to be interpreted literally, that you could argue, if you go to the original Bible, that a day encompassed many thousands of years, and then you could argue that it was through metaphor and such. But the point is, neither these two nor Zechariah Sitchin's tablets, I mean, the ones that he documented, had a real clear grasp, although the latter did come the closest. So this vision of the inception of humanity started with a view of the planet Earth, and it was 432,000 years ago, and he could deduce this by overlaying certain frequencies and sound as well as visual, and there were vertical comments, and all the writing was vertical, and it wasn't just by the Apelos, belonging to the Apelos civilization, it was galactic type of writing, extraterrestrial. And then he noticed that the Earth's tilt was different back in the day. Egypt was closer to the equator, and that the Earth in that time was very privileged in that there was a celestial influence that was exerted by 6 stars, and in the middle was the Earth, and this was accompanied by the letter E. It was next to each of the planets, and by the way, every item also had next to it a folder, and he could at any given moment zoom in on it and go into obsessive detail on anything that he saw. So next, he was shown the most advanced primates and beings, apparently, that at least native beings at the time on Earth, which was actually described as being similar to Homo erectus. So probably not quite them. And it showed that they traveled in packs, and they had their leaders, and their leaders actually had a more different glow next to them that was pulsating in a red light, and they were around the Sinai Peninsula and the Persian Gulf.
Persian Gulf, yes.
Gulf, yes. And then it emphasizes this cosmic conjecture at the time that you have a change in down to so it zoomed into that Homo erectus relative, first of all to his tissue, and then to his cells, and then down to the DNA level. And it was noticeable that the carbon atom, thanks to this E influence, was able to create more covalences, which are the atom bonds that are done through electrons. And the rays then multiplied this possibility of their DNA to create all sorts of other connections. And the influence didn't stop at the physical plane. It was even etheric, and this was highlighted by not a direct line, but a curved one. And
one sec. So it amplified the nucleus of the DNA with the atomic electrical charge, right? To change the nucleus of the DNA peptides and the binding to expand it. So to make the DNA bigger is what I'm getting, that the purpose of that E was the function.
Yes, of course, yes, to act complexity, because that's the key. The simpler, the more basic the DNA is, the less lasting and the weaker and the more ineffectual. So it actually goes into quite a bit of depth, but it's the first influence was just mainly applied to the carbon atom. So next, there was a star network even he noticed there was certain entities between the stars that he could see as sort of filaments, and they are responsible for what we call astrology, I guess. But in this case, he could actually highlight because of the overtones. And next comes the maybe biggest bombshell for me of this book, which is that Nibiru, what we think is Nibiru, is not really a planet, although you can't be faulted for thinking it is, because it is that size. It's a little smaller than the moon, apparently, and it is not gray, but is light blue. But the catch is it's actually a ship, a mothership, and belonging to the Syrians, of course, and that came here after 60,000 years from the initial influence. And by the way, these influences, in the case of the one 430,000 years ago, lasted 10,000 years, and even had effects for about 50,000 years after that. So they're very slow, but it is only through it that the rest was possible. But that's not actually what drew this ship, called actually Nibiru, not Nibiru, in. And I think you mentioned that in your book about hollowed out craft, that it's a way for advanced species to travel. Am I right?
Yeah, there's hollowed out planetoids that could be terraformed and transformed whatever living environment that you want to create. And in the history that I have, Nibiru or Nibiru or however you call it, there's certain ways to call it, came here about 450,000 years ago. So it's very close to those dates.
Same ballpark.
Yeah, and there's a version of Zechariah Sitchin that it was the Anunnaki, the Anu, yeah, or the Syrians, because they all interbred. They also had some reptilian blood in it, because the queen, to unite the races finally and to stop the galactic wars, the reptilian wars and the Lyran wars, they sort of united, right? And the reptilians kind of merged with the queen and the Syrians. So there's some reptilian stuff in there. There's Anunnaki, there's Syrian bloodlines. So these people were a mixture of those things. And supposedly they were looking to mine for gold to restore the atmospheric pressure of their craft,
yes,
their planet, whatever you want to call it, because they needed to pressurize the planetary tilt itself so it wouldn't be wonky when it was stationary in orbit. When it was traveling, it was okay, but when you use the world engines to station it somewhere, so it actually, holds steady in orbit like normal planets do, and it's not moving around in galaxies, the tilt was off because they didn't have enough gold in the atmosphere.
Exactly right. And the reason why it arrived here, I forgot to mention, was that they had been involved in a war, and it was very ferocious, and they were in dire need of gold, but also other metals, it was said. But the principal one was indeed gold. And you're right about the part hybridization with the Draco, but that's only a sect of it. I mean, it's not mentioned whether the Nibiru ones were, but it's true that Anunnaki, which is, a blanket term for all Syrians, which is probably not right, but that's just what we termed them as. And we'll get to why that's, a bit of an error on our part later. But anyway, so they arrived here and mined for gold. That was their initial mission, and they left it in orbit. They sent shuttlecraft here, and then it moves on to their commander, a 2.5 meter tall, no hair, and his skull was elongated towards the back, and his skin was white, and he had a deep respect for nature and very, very meditative. And his name was Tenekau. And in a sense, you could call him the father of humanity. And he noticed at one point the boldest of the Homo erectus relatives and the most curious. They approached him while he was just levitating certain boxes that they placed vertically, which would then emit filaments, and they would enter the earth and then in a very efficient manner extract the gold and other metals. But the problem was that even this maneuvering was still costly for them because they were incompatible with both the soil and the atmosphere. And so Tennecow at one point just bows his head to the left, and that's when his genius idea hits him, which is that of actually using these Homo erectus to mine, to do the dirty work, but also to help them advance. Not all the way yet, but they were also these section of the Anunnaki were very spiritual and didn't have the bad reputation. They actually had a very excellent reputation in the whole galaxy as spiritual masters. You have others that were offshoots of them, especially ones around Orion's belt, that didn't have quite such a clean record, and those are the ones responsible for the subsequent dumbing down of humanity, which happened in our more recent history. So,
Is that Enki and Enlil?
well, first of all, I'm pretty sure that Enki and Enlil are titles, not people, and we'll get to why that is in a little bit. But also the initial arrival of Nibiru and this whole noticing the potential of the primates was described in the holographic account as the descent of Enki. So that was pretty interesting. But this he noticed Tennecow as an opportunity, as a double purpose, as I said. He further wanted to capitalize on the celestial influences. So they took their entire ship and beamed certain frequencies towards, for example, the moon, so it would have a stronger astrological effect, or towards the earth or towards the sun, and whatever was necessary. They had such etheric apparatus that was capable of such in their control rooms. Initially, Nibiru was mainly oriented towards military and security. And the reason why Tennecow was especially compatible with the primates was, it turns out that he was born on the ship. So he just so happened to also enjoy the effects of this alignment that was pivotal in the early, the pre-humans. So the first thing they did was he took a giant 10-meter long sphere that had also a special device and a huge display and control panel and a chair that he would sit in the room, and around him, as far away as miles, he also had scattered some cylinders that would extract metals through laser, and that emitted a white light, I think, and that would telepathically guide the Homo erectus. And this went on for quite a long period, but after a while, some of the Homo erectus, after their influence by all these Syrians, managed to stop displaying any fear and form clusters and even exhibit a new type of change in their DNA that was represented by the letter T. And this wasn't haphazard at all, because it turns out that when it comes to ET symbols, they are universal, and in this case, it was the shape that the stars around where the Syrians came from formed. And there were two large genetic families of the primates that were much advanced of anything else on the planet. So the first was marked by the letter E, N, which represented ability to create bonds, but then you had L and K, and the ENLs had a much bigger biofield, and they were the only ones of the two that managed to tap into the etheric plane as much as the physical. And they were thinner, their bodies were more harmonious, and 2.5 meters tall, and less physically robust, and longer lived as well. And the ENKs were not courted very much by the ETs because later more and more showed up, not just the Syrians, but the Syrians pretty much were the most pivotal and the only ones for the first 2,000 of years. And they were shorter, the ENKs, and it didn't end up being hybridized because of their coarser nature. They couldn't be worked with by the ETs, so they were more or less left to their own devices. And they also didn't have much, if any, psychic skills, whereas the ENLs were very highly gifted. And finally, after a while, they managed to create the first prototype of human that was able to withstand an advanced ET soul. And this was only after the group that went towards the coast. For some reason, the more advanced ones preferred those locations, and they managed to through cloning, because at first this was the only way. There were still too large of a gap, but through cloning, it was possible for Tenekau to accelerate evolving the humans, the Homo erectus, to transfer his consciousness into the first clone that was compatible, that had about 80% ET DNA and 20% primate. And they were 2.5 meters tall, but they didn't have the elongated skull. And before I move on, I believe you are experienced in the matter of transfer of consciousness, and know it's possible and that it was performed by ETs.
Yeah, it's actually, so basically the whole consciousness or a portion of the consciousness can be taken out from the body through electromagnetic frequency coding, right? And put in an electromagnetic cylinder holding container to hold the energy of the soul, and then transfer that energy to another body that is genetically compatible with their original body. So genetics do play some role in that. And then the consciousness takes an hour or so, or even a week sometimes, to adjust to the new body. And then sort of is like getting to know the body, like physically walking, talking. It's an adjustment, because if you were in a taller body and you're going to a smaller body, or if you were male going into a female body, if there's a difference in how the body feels, looks, and functions, you adjust, because you're looking through a new set of eyes when the soul comes into that body. And so it's like a week, 1 week to adjust, sometimes even longer. Again, if the parameters or the body of this body that you're in now is different than what you were originally in, you have an adjustment period. If the body is very similar and the gender is the same, it's less time for adjustment, and you're quicker to walk, to talk, to adjust to the peripherals of the body. And sometimes this was done experimentally on, like in the secret space programs, it's done for missions. And then after you're done with your mission, whether you were in a clone, an avatar body, or a biological human cyborg where the soul consciousness was transferred into, then when you're done with your mission, you go back into your original body. The soul is transferred back into your body while your body was in a stasis, a pod, chamber, regen tank, or stasis pod itself, like, or how or the med bed, holographic medical pod. The body stays in stasis to stay alive, your original body, so it doesn't die, right? And then your soul goes back through same electromagnetic frequency adjustment and change, put back into the first electromagnetic container. That's the midway point of this technology. Then put it back into the original body. And then the clone body or the avatar or the cyborg body, that will go into stasis because that's a holding container vessel for souls to go into. So sometimes somebody else might go into that body if, again, they're genetically compatible through mixture of DNA, and you can rewrite the genetic DNA coding for that body. You can rewrite it and reuse the body, preferably not to do that because soul residual component sort of has a cellular memory. So there is a portion of the soul's knowing in the body that it entered. So if another soul goes into that body, they could be very mixed up with soul fragmentation of the previous occupant's memories. So it could be very traumatizing for the soul because this is a complicated process. Switching out bodies, swapping memories, energy, frequency. It's all in DNA, it's all so intermingled, it's so intricate. You have to be very careful with how you do that stuff.
Right. So I wasn't aware that it goes quite that deep, but it's good because it doesn't have the room, this book, to go into that much depth, and it only mentions that there were a few other clones of this type just as backup, but this first one was pivotal because Tenekal could project himself through there, and just happens that he never inhabited his old body ever again, but we'll get to why that is later. And I forgot to mention that the group that retreated to the coast, the most decisive influence that they actually had was represented by the hexagon symbol, which represented the influence of the Nibiru ship. And it translated, in addition to their loss of fear, to a lot of joy and refined emotions and feelings and states of exaltation. And this was the first time this happened. And when he could quicker affect this group, he sent in a report to the Supreme Council, which was on their home planet of the Syrians, and that he wanted to focus more on this project instead of what they had first intended to do. And it came back that the decision for them to scout Earth as a possible mining location was actually a galactic one, that it was celestial subtle entities that decided it eons ago, and that it was meant to be. And he was quite elated about this, and the entirety of the mothership then reoriented their activities towards this evolution of humanity, with only a small branch remaining for security purposes. And in short order, it actually doubled the population of Syrians on the ship because of how exciting this project was. And the end goal was to use the new specimens on Earth to incarnate as them once that was possible. Then you have more and more human-like qualities among the ENLs and ENKs, but especially ENLs. And they turned upright eventually. They lost their body hair, and in time, even got through a lot of upgrades. And like I mentioned with the rebudding of Tenekal, but also others, they got through hybridizations to where they could, for the first time, give birth to the first human that was on par with the ETs, and he was Adam. Which actually, it turns out that there's more than one Adam, but the first one came at around 360,000 something years ago. And as soon as he was an embryo, he was sensed, his DNA, that he was as good of hybrid between Homo erectus and the ETs as they were ever going to get. So they peaked really early, but the problem, of course, is that he was just one, and you have to look at the big picture. But he was extremely refined, and from before inception, they took him out of the womb and put him in a sac, alveola, in a certain gel that also had some strange white threads in it. And as soon as he opened his eyes, Radu could see that he was in a trance already, and he had very distinct features. So he was also very meditative. He wouldn't speak a lot, but here's another one that could be considered even more so a father of humanity, even though he too was androgynous. So this was actually before the apparition of the sexes, and he lived over 750 years, which is in accordance with the Bible, and it was only made possible by the heavy hybridization prior to it. But next comes the very important step of the implementation of the sexes, because the specimens, although they were, highly sought after, it was only after a few thousands of years that they could establish the differentiation of the sexes. And it was done through the help of the moon, which was also accelerated by the ships there. This whole process is a tightrope, and you have to treat it with extreme attention, because you can't fabricate DNA. I mean, you can, but it's not going to last if it's just a clone. You have to give it time to adjust naturally. So the seeding of civilizations that Syrians are experts in is the opposite of a fad. But also, was there talk in the planetary corporations about this hybridizations having limits as well?
Basically, it's a cultivation of DNA to mix human DNA with certain ET species to make it as humanoid as possible. 2 legs, 2 arms, the standard, this form we're in, it seems to be the common denominator form in most of the planets and the galaxies. I mean, there's variation of beings, but when you branch out from creating aquatic DNA species, it gets complicated because they have gills, fins, tails, then making sure they can shift back with having legs, So the more specialized genetic hybridization that you do with the aquatics and humans, the harder it is to create the hybrid if it's too exotic. So you have to make sure it can merge between the human form and its own form and shapeshift into the genetics. Because oftentimes you have to be bipedal on planets like Earth, but in aquatic worlds, you need to be bipedal and you need to be aquatic, both. So the DNA sequencing has to match those parameters of what the requirements are per planetary standards, how you're going to live on the planet. That has to be factored into the genetics, how you create the human ET hybridization, whichever species you're mixing in together. It all has to do with where they'll be living, on which planet, what atmosphere, what requirements they have. All of that has to be sequenced into the genetic hybridization of one species with another species, or multiple species mixed in with the genetic pool to create that cultivated being that they're going for, right? For whatever planetary system it's necessary for. All of that has to be taken into adjunct as the whole, not just one part of DNA, but as the whole. There's many parts of genomic sequencing, hybridization, but you have to look at the end result at the end and the beginning sequencing parameters of what you're mixing in for which specific species type. Because the parameters all have to fit for the end result to work correctly. If it doesn't, then you have sort of a botched hybridization job and you have to start all over again or in the middle point until you evolve it to the correct sequencing frequency of genetics into that whole being that you're looking for to create. So I wouldn't say it's a hurry up and do it process. Sure, you can mature a clone in the maturation tank within a couple of weeks or months, and you can stick a soul into it, but that's just a halfway stopgap to transferring souls. It's not a permanent solution. If you want a complete integrated ET human hybrid, then you take time to cultivate the genetics and all the factors that come with it to make sure that particular being does not collapse and can live long life, can function, can do anything it needs on the planet that it was specifically created for, or even adapt to different worlds, that the genetics continue adapting on their own after the hybridization is done. So it's very complex. I wouldn't say it's a slapstick of you mix this, you mix that DNA, and here you go, you've created it. It takes time, it takes responsibility, it takes higher thought processes to create good hybrids.
Of course. The only thing that is stressed here is that it's not open heart about is that it's incomplete. As much as it's excellent, but if you really want to do it in a way that can be used to actually populate entire planets, as we're soon going to find out it was the case with us, then you need more than hybridization. So it's an essential component, but it's insufficient on its own.
Well,
right?
the DNA has to be sequenced correctly for all of it to work as a whole unit. If you don't think of the genetic ramifications, you're going to get halfway hybridization done. If you factor in everything, like what I just said, everything, then you can create the perfect seeded race. If all the parameters are factored in correctly and everything is sequenced, accounted for, the body type, the DNA type, the purpose of where that's going to be living or with whom, the energies of the body, the soul capacity, how much soul can go into the container vessel as well. Because the soul has a frequency, and the soul frequency has to be compatible with the hybridized body for the soul to fit into it correctly. So all of that has to be accounted for as a whole to complete a hybridization genetic engineering program. And as was done with Homo erectus, it was done slowly by the energy fields of the planetoids, Nibiru, Moon, and another one, right? Like you said. So it's energetically adapting the DNA in a very slow manner. The programs, the SSPs, have figured out how to do this within a year or two, within months. But they have to figure out the perfect parameters as a whole. What makes life continue on ticking once the hybridization is done? Have it fixed, have it stable, have it working. That's what they take into parameters. So it actually works properly. ET human hybridization to its complete sequence from start, middle, and finish.
Yes, and this seeding of new species, I think even one of your interviewees called Meta said that is considered a currency in the whole universe for the advanced species. That, of course, it involves hybridizations, but it's not limited to it. You also have to account for the celestial influences and just Mother Nature, which it has to do at least half the work here. And also, you mentioned ensoulments, and this is exactly what I was gonna go next. That after the implementation of the sexes, you finally could get the incarnations that the ETs wanted. It was still downgrade for them because they came from the astral plane, generally, it's said, but it was an attractive prospect for them, and only certain of them were suited for this. So they presumably knew which one to call here. And once they were here, they were pretty much stuck here. But that was, initially it was of their own volition to come. And after further hybridizations with, as it described, as many as 20 or a little more species, and it's also mentioned at one point that the most influential next to the Syrians in our formation were the Pleiadians and the Arcturians. So after this further installment, you also had described that they were used to see the other planets. So we have a lot of ENLs that are probably in the billions, if not more, trillions maybe now.
And
You want to say something?
Lyrans too, because their DNA is very strong.
I'm sure. Yeah, it didn't go into all of them. It's a limited book. It only has like 500 pages or something. But and also it mentions that the Arcturians had a big contribution in our 12 strands of DNA. Their input was huge there because they're the best healers and medics around, right? And I think But before I ask you, they also mentioned that they had ENLs that were amphibious, and they were highly sought after by the Pleiadians. And I was curious, it doesn't mention whether they were taken off Earth or not. And also, if you can quickly describe if you know the influence of the Arcturians and Pleiadians, and whether there are still amphibious creatures that are able to, mate with us, that are part of humanity on Earth today.
Well, I'm mostly familiar with aquatic, what was done in Mintaka, the planet Mintaka, how the mermaids came here and how they were given the shape-shifting ability. Because on Mintaka, they were swimming in the water. That's a water planet. When they came here, there's more land here. So their genetics were adjusted so they can shift between having a tail and going to legs and back and forth. So this is what I know of the aquatic genetic modification. The amphibian one, that one I'm not that familiar with. I mean, what I know is that it takes some ingenuity genetically to make sure you can grow a tail and balance the amphibian morphogenics with the humanoid body. So it is all about genetic tweaking until you get it right. If you have something wrong, you adjust it, you fix it, and continue on until you build up the perfect genetic profiling to match the species type. So that's how best I can describe it. And if something isn't perfect in, say, an amphibious form or an aquatic form, they keep working on it until it's perfectly right to preserve the beings.
I actually forgot whether they were referred to as aquatic or amphibian. So you might have already addressed, the aquatic. It might have just been aquatic. I'm not actually sure right now.
Well,
but the mermaids.
Yeah,
right?
the mermaids, and because there's amphibians, reptilians, and mermaids, there were different types of species on Earth. I mean, the planet is 4.3 billion years old.
At least.
Yeah, so probably, and the universe is like billions of years. So there's been so many different species types genetically engineered on this planet. This planet has been the birthing place of seeding different genetic races and doing different genetic experiments and projects. Atlantis was one of those projects with the ETs, and they modified energetically the DNA of the hominids on this planet as well. So, and that was done 2 million years ago. Atlantis is older than people think.
Well, we'll get there in a short while.
But there's a lot.
Yeah, I have to hurry. I'm noticing. I can't keep up with so much material. But so the crossing between ENKs and ENLs, because they did happen, they were attracted to one another, although there was this huge gap between them. They represented the demigods, and because many of the gods actually were no more than ENLs because they had godlike abilities. And you have many gods in human history, as many as thousands, even just from our records. And the main difference between the ENLs and ENKs, aside from what I mentioned, is the fact that the ENKs because they were left alone by and large, they now came into their own finally, because they, being more physical, they have this extra longevity. And the ENLs, although they were this grand project and they were, highly touted, their civilizations didn't live quite that long. They rarely more than 15,000 years. It actually mentions that the longest lasting of these civilizations from the history of humanity was Mu, which lasted 40,000 years. Then you have the Hyperboreans, which was 35,000 years, and then Atlantis, which is this last version of Atlantis, which was 25,000 years. And also that Tenekau left his inheritance genetically. He was, just because he died a few thousand years later doesn't mean that he didn't leave his legacy. It's still noticeable in the DNAs. And also, about 350,000 years ago was when the law of non-intervention was decreed, and it stated that each region of the planet was essentially that culture's little garden, and that you were not to cross it and to affect the others. And that explains why you have such huge gaps, such huge chasms between advancements in civilizations throughout the history. You have, ones that just carve spearheads, and next to them you have ones that have anti-gravitic craft and extremely refined architecture and stuff like this. And
yeah, that explains Atlantis, because they were not to interfere with the hominids that had evolved into the humanoid species. They can energetically advance their DNA, but not physically interfere with them. So the Atlanteans weren't seen by the hominids. The hominids were doing their own thing, the Atlanteans their own thing, with the ET and humanoid, some of the more advanced humanoids mixed in the Atlantean colonies and outposts. So that makes sense, because there's pockets of the Earth for everything that needed to be its own species in genetic projects. So multiple Gardens of Eden, you would say.
Yeah, and all of them record seeing these advanced creatures, which is no more than ENLs. So they could have bred with them, it seems. But also, one very important characteristic about the ENLs is that the reason why their civilizations didn't live that long was because of the speed of their evolution, which was so aided by the ETs. This is why it's not necessarily such a huge advantage, because before too long, they outlived their physicality and simply no longer incarnated in a 3D body. So I think you could call it an apotheosis, or when you become godlike or something, but it's nothing more than exceeding this the need to have a vessel here. And this was the case. This is the reason why Tenekau no longer was seen afterwards. And before I move on to the more recent history, I wanted you to maybe quickly go over your Anunnaki encounter. I think you actually saw one.
No, I never had an Anunnaki encounter.
Assyrian encounter.
Yes.
The same thing.
I went to Nibiru, and they have various levels of different species living on Nibiru. Syrians or Anunnaki. Well, I don't call them Anunnaki. I always call them Syrians.
Well, Syrians probably encompasses also many others, because being that Sirius is, if you go by Sirius A, that's a whole star system, and presumably there's other species there.
Yeah, exactly. So when I went to Nibiru, there's the planet, how it is currently, the traveling, you can call it a mothership, a planet, whatever you want. It has different levels for different species, and it has its own environments for the species. So I went into the Syrian environment because it's very similar to us in the breathing. It has similar facilities, rooms. It looked the most familiar to me. That particular habitat environment And they were teaching me about crystals and sound harmonics and healing that way with frequencies and sound. So, and they taught me crystal grids. They were the first to teach me what crystal gridding is and healing frequency. They're so into music, they're so into harmonics, into green spaces. So this resonated with my energy into what I wanted to explore. And they're teachers. The Syrian habitat, environmental habitat, they're the teachers. So they're the wisdom keepers. So that's the one that I visited and I learned from them. And there's other species. So they're very inclusive on Nibiru. They're very inclusive of other species who are peaceful, who are loving, who are kind. There's no war, there's no strife, there's no disagreements between these different habitats, because this is a social experiment to see if they can coexist peacefully. That's what's happening on Nibiru, what I saw. So it's not the same what it used to be thousands of years ago.
I wish I had the time to ask you 1,000 questions about Nibiru.
Yeah, I don't think it has the same purpose as it originally had. Now it's for unification of species, so that different types of species can live together in unity and harmony.
That's exactly how it's described here too.
Yeah, without emphasizing their differences, not going to war with each other because of their differences, but harmonizing with finding common ground and similarities and harmonizing that into peaceful coexistence. That's what the current experiment on Nibiru is.
Yeah, but I think it's important to point out that this mainly is limited for the time being to humanity, because even though we're not their first such experiment, and actually they went to bat for us because we're considered a basket case and a risky at first, and the observers, because there are such things as observing civilizations, and Radu was shown this through this Akashic device, that they witness from behind the veil of the etheric plane so as to not be noticed, because it was a distortion field there. And anyway, what the observers don't realize is that humanity has a huge potential. But anyway, and this is why Anunnaki vouch for us. But that also, I think that Nibiru only deals with the humans and the ones that they also use to seed other planets.
Not just humans, there's all kinds of species, green. I saw aquatics, I saw reptilian type of species. So I wouldn't say just human. There's a lot of different species that look nothing like us on Nibiru that are coexisting with a humanoid type species. So this is a social experiment. Take Arcturians, Syrians, reptilians, take the whole gamut of the different types, put them all together and have them find common ground and similarities, and put aside the differences. The two different types they are, the farther they are from each other, the better they'll do together, because they'll have to find common ground, commonality. To get along, you find your common ground.
Cool. Yep.
And that creates peace, that creates harmony, that creates good coexistence, good sharing of neighborly commonality. Again, this is what we have on Earth, the melting pot of the different types of humanoids that are on Earth. We're not all the same looking. There's Asian, there's Native Americans, there's African Americans, there's all kinds of genetic experiments now.
Oh yeah.
Together, and we're called human. We're called Earthlings because we live on the same planet.
And this is just what we have now, but the variation of humanity is even bigger than we could even imagine. And it's even just the races, which we'll get to know a little bit, how they got formed, the current ones. The variation of even just ENKs was still bigger during the Hyperborean era. But anyway, so 100,000 years ago, he was shown quick glimpses of the most devastating of all the wars since the inception of humanity, which was actually an ET war. And it happened both in the atmosphere and on the ground. And it was so devastating that it used weaponry that was above nuclear, and the sky sometimes was red because of it. And the reason, the main reason behind it was apparently the influence of, well, they're described as evil reptilians. I'll leave it up to maybe you later to guess who they are, but also the way they operate is by subversion. They just look for species that aren't too advanced, but neither are they too primitive, so they can work with them, and they hybridize with them just between 2 to 3%, and then they use this influence, which is higher in certain people in authority, to just manipulate us however they want. And this didn't just go for humans. The reason why this war happened was because they had also infiltrated a galactic alliance that oversaw Earth at the time, which included Syrians and other races that are known to be positive, like Pleiadians, and they caused strife there. And in this case, the original Syrians that made us only acted as mediators, even though they apparently had the technology to quell these reptilians. They stay out of it because it spanned multiple planets, this certain war. So that's why. And it was so ferocious that there was a 20,000 year cooldown that was needed. At the same time, this book is quite objective, and it says that the influence of the quote unquote evil reptilians was as much of a necessity for the ultimate thriving of the human DNA as anything else, because ETs that want to incarnate, it made it even more inviting for them, especially the ones that already had a certain karmic limitation set on them, and this allowed them to use Earth as like an accelerated university or whatnot.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you about this. What do you think is behind this reptilian infiltration, and what do you know about the Earth as a nursery for souls?
So the Draco reptilians were the invading ones with the nuclear type weapons bombarding from space. And I know this during the period of Atlantis, because the 2 million year one, that's when it fell. They had space bridges, spaceports. They had an Andromeda space station above the Earth, the Atalan. That I remember. I did an extensive 8-hour remote viewing of the Atlantic, the Pacific parts. I went all over the Earth to see what was happening to Atlantis, why it fell, why the advanced 2 million year civilization fell. It was because it was being bombarded by the reptilians from above, from space, and that destroyed it. So that makes sense. And then you had the more primitive versions of Atlantis, you know, the 30,000 year one, the 40,000, the 9,500, 600, you know, Poseidon is saying. Then you have those smaller versions, the other epochs, because there's 4 to 5 epochs of Atlantis's advancement. You start from 2 million years ago, where all the ET groups came together and, you know, did the genetic peaceful experiment. You had the mermaids, you had all of that 2 million years, great. You had those circular cities, right, expanding outwards,
of course,
all over the planet. You had these different ET groups living together, peacefully coexisting. Then you had the Homo erectus and all the other garden variety genetic projects going on peacefully in harmony. Nobody interfered with each other. And then after that reptilian invasion, all of that fell apart, and sort of we devolved from the advancements to more going back to, you have to restart all over again, and you keep the remnants of what you remember as an advanced civilization, but you keep it more simpler. And then you had your hierarchy start and more infiltration by reptilians. So then the whole Egypt, Thoth the Atlantean, where the Atlanteans, the remnants of Atlantis, the peoples, they went to Egypt, they went to Peru, and so on. And then you had the Enki and Enlil, again, tweaking humans to adjust them, right, against reptilian mind control and blah, blah, blah. And the strong Lyran DNA was resistant to the reptilians genetically trying to, there were Lyran colonies, that was Lemuria. Actually, that was the Lyran Pleiadian colonies. So the reptilians couldn't subvert those colonies. So you have that basic current history, and there's another flood that wiped that out because again, there's so much going on. So you have that, all of that history. We'll call this the current history. What happened after the reptilians sank Atlantis, the advanced version. And then Lemuria went too, and Mu went as well because of all this change and stuff. So I would say the Draco changed the landscape, what went down after.
They were heavily involved going as far back as the dinosaurs, so it's not a surprise that you finger them as being the culprits here, although they're necessary as well.
Yeah, everything is a learning lesson, I think, for human evolution, for spirit, soul evolution. Tiamat was heavily influenced by the reptilians, because there was an advanced species of humanoids living on Tiamat and Maldak, right? But the reptilian infiltration sort of caused mind control issues as well for the beings on Tiamat. The planet exploded. Maldak also exploded. Those are two separate planets. Two separate planets. Tiamat was a water world, like a huge water world. Tiamat was a smaller world that was somewhat water and land masses. So, and the water, when Tiamat exploded, the water from Tiamat flooded Earth, and a bunch of fish and species fell from the evaporating oceans of Tiamat. It fell right on, it was dumped on Earth, and that caused a huge flood and other fish types and aquatics evolving. So as part of osmosis, all that stuff, the bacteria, everything from Tiamat's oceans, the traveling fauna in the species got dumped on Earth that way. So that's part of history, the flood, the one of the floods. And a lot of the humanoid species went to live underground, like the Native Americans have in their history. For a while, they went underground, and then when the sun reappeared, and when all that water calmed down from coming off of Tiamat, when that calmed down, the ocean levels went back to normal, and the landforms reformed, resurfaced. The humans came out from the underground cavern systems. That was there already, actually, on this planet, long before we were here. That was here. The structure, the inner Earth structure was here. So this is like the overall history. If you put it, it's the overall history in a nutshell, kind of.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to add before we go to book 7?
Oh, actually, well, I don't know, because I didn't even get to Atlantis and pretty much have to, right? But and also the more recent history, and you did mention that they also went to inner Earth, which is true. Like, I forgot to mention that when the ENLs could no longer incarnate here, they would either go to ET planets, or they would go to inner Earth because the higher frequencies there. But I'm gonna go, quickly over the other notable civilizations, which were, one was called the Tars, and they lived between 70 and 50,000 years ago, and there was a huge war down to their quibbling over portals between the planes, between the third and fourth. And this even included places that are now under Shambhala, because at first Shambhala was just etheric cities, if you want. And they later got united under one. And they were only accessible to the NLs and very, very few select ENKs. And anyway, this war by the Tars even though it wasn't as devastating as the ET war, and by the way, their civilization spanned the middle third vertically of Europe, from the Scandinavia down to about Greece. And at the time, the Scandinavia wasn't even separated by water, only lakes and rivers. And their area of battle got smaller and smaller as the rift between the third and fourth got bigger and bigger. And it climaxed in a place in southern Poland that had a certain ENLs, but predominantly demigods fighting, but also ENKs with their more primitive tech. But so this was a very unsightly war, and it was so bad for the frequencies on the Earth. It even affected the astral plane, which is according to this book, is the fifth density.
Yeah, so let's touch up on Atlantis and Egypt and India, like, because those seem to be the histories that people are very curious about. So does this book 6 talk about what happened in those histories?
Sure, just a few sentences on, because Hyperboreans were the next in line. They're, you could say, progeny of the Tars. They occupied the same land, and they were actually only also the Tars. They have many beliefs, and this also contributed to the war. But Hyperboreans were not like that, and they were very, as I said, there was the second longest lived civilization of ENLs, and so they encouraged unity, but also had a lot of diversity. You had the biggest diversity of all because of the crossings between the ENLs and ENKs. They more and more went towards the demigods, but eventually the entirety of the Earth got dominated population-wise by ENKs. And so Shambhala also started 120,000 years ago, and it was in stages. At first, like I said, just scattered cities that were very, very elevated. But after this war that was 50,000 years ago, and during the Hyperboreans' time, there was another nasty war, not quite as bad, but still bad enough, between the year 30,000 and 26,000 that ETs that were overseeing us had to call in to create a council in Teotihuacan, and that's the origin of the races we know today, because each continent was assigned a certain ET species, because that's the point in time when the ENKs inherited the Earth, because they, first of all, like I said, the ENLs more and more departed, and also they were finally refined enough, they after all the crossings, and so they were considered eligible. And it's not disclosed which races of ETs resulted in the races of humans, because it's not because he didn't see them, but because it's too controversial. I am curious about it myself, but also that's also the time where the ENKs were acquainted with the advanced sciences that we know today, and also that's about the time when the ETs actually retreated by and large from the Earth, and Atlantis was the last real outpost of VNLs at the time of its existence. And it was distributed throughout the Atlantic Ocean. It had a big continent that was somewhat triangle shaped, but the north tip is where Philadelphia is, but it was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it also went as far as the Bahamas, which are apparently a remnant, and also the Azores. And it had the equivalent of a third pole because of metallic rock that were multi-layered under it, and that apparently is still a feature today, and that it facilitated travel to extraterrestrial places, and that's why it was a hub of ETs. And most of the population lived on the islands or on the coast also, interestingly, but you did have a big spaceport in the middle of that big continent, and it had a huge pyramid that dwarfed anything we know today in terms of pyramids, and it had a huge ruby colored crystal on top, and also it had tubes. The architecture was circular, of course, in the cities, and you had all sorts and shapes and sizes of crafts, and a variety in the architecture as well, because it had many ETs. But at first, you knew you were an Atlantean because your aura was yellow, and they were proud to wear the symbol of the sun always. But in time, there was more and more of a rift where you had the scientists and the nobility, which developed more of, let me think, an orange aura, and then you had the elders and wisest, more spiritually oriented people who developed a light blue aura. And it also is mentioned that you had, like you said, a nefarious species that contributed to this rift, but wasn't limited to it. It was also the fact that this materialistically oriented people with the orange aura also did unthinkable experiments on their brethren, which are the ENKs, but they didn't account for the fact that they were, entangled with them in terms of genetics. And when they hybridized them with lower species like, say, horses, which was where we get the centaurs from, and others like snakes, they also did themselves a huge disservice. And this was the main reason behind the rift. And the destruction of it wasn't overnight, like Plato said. It was gradual. It lasted thousands of years. And about 1200 years before the final destruction, because there was such a thing, like you mentioned as well, with the flooding, but before that, it was manifested through just the main continent going more and more underwater till you had smaller islands. And there are even included maps of that he saw, the Radu. And now I was going to ask you to say if this meshes with what you know about the rift and the architecture and everything.
Yeah, it does. Like we've discussed it and I sort of went over it. Yeah, the cities were circular. They were by water always, by trees, land. They had, when Atlantis fell after the Draco invaded, it went to the caste system, just like what you just described. So, and they didn't have off-world capacity so much to leave off-world. They still had some portal systems on the planet that they could go through, but they were starting to sail on ships and they were using gold and copper to rebuild their cities. So this is what I know, but can we also talk about Egypt and India and what happened there?
That's exactly where I was going.
Good.
But also, my family just arrived. So let's get to the Egyptian pyramids, the way they were actually built. So this vision starts with a room in which there were 4 ETs and 2 Atlanteans, because I forgot to mention that before the fall of Atlantis, the people with the light blue aura sensed that they got outnumbered and they sensed that it wasn't going to go down well. So they either retreated to ET planets or inner Earth, or if they were still tied to the physical plane, they went to teach on the knowledge and sciences of the ENLs to certain outposts on each continent. So you had, of course, one in China, one in Scandinavia, I think, one in the Central America, and the one in Africa, of course, is Egypt. And so the 2 Atlanteans and 4 ETs, 3 of which were Syrians, they were also looking for certain alignments, because whenever they start such a project, this is the key element, is grounding it, making it long lasting, and making it as prosperous as they can. And they made extremely elaborate and higher dimensional calculations that included all these proportions and stats that Radu was kind of compounded by anyway. But the building of the pyramids was also nothing of like what is described. First of all, so if you have to put a date on it, it's after the fall of Atlantis, shortly after, and that was apparently roughly 13.5 thousand years ago. And the building of them, first of all, they were quarried by a large ship that was in Libya, actually, not Egypt, and it emitted like laser jets and cut certain blocks, and then these in turn were picked up by little drone ships which had half spheres underneath, and they would, I guess, tractor beam each one of them. But before that, they would also emit some lasers and carve specific symbols on each one, so you didn't have a single block that is alike. And this is part of they were each tied to certain celestial bodies, and they were in a straight line headed back to Egypt, to the Giza plateau. And they were also, the construction was done simultaneously. In total, it took 24 years, but it was very organized. You had some ETs that were, and Atlanteans that were overlooking it from the ground, but that's it. They didn't pick up anything, even with their mind. That was all done by ships. And you had a larger ship, at least one, that oversaw these smaller ones that was about 120 meters in diameter, and made sure there was an order. And you have the certain, apparently telepathically controlled natives that with their chisels just got to make their little markings too. And this probably led to a lot of confusion subsequently. Anyway, also, the main purpose of these was to establish communication, and I can only assume that it's with the Orion's belt, because some are there because of the stars that are matched in intensity. Their light matches the three main stars in Orion, I think, that are noticeable, to the size of the pyramids. And there are many other things that are beyond coincidence in their construction, like where they're placed in basically in the center of the Earth. I mean, if you consider the landline and stuff.
The
And,
perfect triangle or the perfect circumference.
And there's many other proportions like that. Like if you multiply its weight and its parameter, you get to like the distance between us and the sun and all sorts of other things that escape me right now, but it's easy to look up. And the offset of for example, the Cheops pyramid is only 6 millimeters from its center. And each of the pyramids involve millions of blocks, and some of them are as heavy as 40 tons, and it's ridiculous to go by the accepted theories. But also they were finished in a white type of material that also was translucent, and they were capped by crystals that were shiny and powerful. And so the other purpose, aside from beaming out information and receiving from other planets, was to help in general the ENKs. They needed the support because they had been pretty much left on their own. And this also went hand in hand with all the other pyramids, because they only really started about 100,000 years ago, when the evil reptilians, as they're described, made a sort of grid over the Earth that infused it with negative frequencies, and this was to counter that. It doesn't go into a huge amount of detail, but it was to feed the humans as well as to communicate. So, and you also have a lot of complexity inside the rooms and chambers. Apparently, the king's chamber sarcophagus was meant to act as a place where you could astral travel from, and only the priests had access to it. And the style, apparently, of the Giza Plateau pyramids represents the Syrians from Sirius A, and the ones from Teotihuacan represents the one from Orion's belt, and the quasi-pyramids from India are in the style of the Pleiadians that helped to seed us. Anyway, at the time of their making, the pyramids, it was actually jungle around, but it did turn into a desert more and more. And at one point, they were even covered more than halfway in sand after their decline. And I also wanted to ask you about your role as Calypso, if this also jives with you, what you have so far.
Yeah, so as Calypso, I remember him using his thought consciousness process, psychic ability, holding a wand, which was a levitation device, and sort of tractor beaming with that wand the blocks and stacking them to make a pyramid shape, to make a precise shape. And he could mentally send adaptable programming to the wand to change the levitation style. And then they had these portable laser devices that would float, anti-grav tech, and carve the blocks, shape it. And then again, you have these priest architects with the wands going around and stacking certain types of pyramids. So they were experimenting. I guess they had the ships that would bring in all the blocks and stuff and stack that. And they had the smaller ships doing the carving, the lasering, but they were also experimenting with mini tractor beam devices and wands where you could press different buttons and do different things and stacking the blocks into triangular pyramid shapes. So that's what I remember him doing in that lifetime, helping to build the Giza Plateau and sort of overseeing the pyramid styles and the shapes being created, formed, carved, and stacked. So basically that's what he was doing. And he also helped to build the Sphinx and and the Egyptian Hall of Records, where the ruby refractory telescopes were hidden that can decloak, cloaking holographic shielding on other planets, and you can see bases and stuff, what's on the moon, what's on Mars. So he put that ruby refractory telescope in the Egyptian Hall of Records, and he created many chambers and mazes under the Sphinx to confuse people. So there's a lot of guarding and security, and there's certain maps carved and hieroglyphic kind of key codes to interpret how to get to the Egyptian Hall records. And it has Atlantean history in there as well, plus technology and stuff. So this is what I remember us doing as Calypso.
Interesting, but I don't know if it was the Sphinx that we know today, because
It
that
is.
one, what
It
it
is the
was.
Sphinx that we know of today, yes.
The only thing is, well, I hate to bring this slight discrepancy to light, that it said that the Sphinx that is next to the Giza plateau was actually different date. It was 25,000 years old and originated in a different town called Helanas. And the pyramids were only started after Atlantis, so 13.5 thousand years ago. So I don't know if Calypso maybe worked on, or was very long lived, or
He was long lived. He says that the pyramids and the Sphinx go back 100 to 80,000 years ago. During the time
pyramids
that
that we know today.
Yes, the pyramids that we know today go back to 100,000 years ago, and the Sphinx goes back to being built 80,000 years ago.
Well, I'll definitely try to keep that in mind. I'm not like set to believe anything, so you know, I'm just going by the book, and this pretty much has had a good track record so far. And anyway, who knows?
Yeah, and I'm going by past life memory experiences from what I saw in my past life, but the information jives, and even people have been saying 25,000 years ago. Some people said the water carved it out, the carbon dating 80,000 years. The Sphinx and the pyramids, the carbon dating, there's all kinds of numbers.
I'm wondering if maybe the way that we have multiple futures possibilities, that we also have multiple pasts. Maybe that would explain it.
Maybe, yeah. I think there's some kind of time frequency stuff, because even history, certain people have their own dates of history and others have, and then you have historical records, and you try to just put the puzzle pieces together, figure out the dates as closely as possible. I mean, you had 430,000 years ago is when humans were modified, and I had 450,000 years ago when that happened. So it's like dates are important to try to figure it out, but the information seems to fit. That's the thing. The info seems to fit.
There's no point in it, because I'm sure there's a logical explanation. In no way do I discount your past life memory. So whatever, it's not that important. It's more important how they were built. And
laser frequency, definitely levitation and carving, lasers, laser beams and carving, and wands and beams, ships, and thought consciousness technology also was involved. So a bit of everything.
Yeah. But still, just to give an objective account of the book, to go back quickly to the Egyptian sphinxes, because apparently, like the inscriptions between its feet, there are two shown. So apparently there were two on either side of the Nile, which at the time was not a delta when it flowed into the Mediterranean, which was much smaller. And it was in Helanas, like I mentioned, which was a sun worshipping place that started 30,000+ years ago, and it was inhabited by elves, which were giant, between 3 and 4 meters. And they had mainly stone cities, but also they were highlighted in gold, and they had a big obelisk in the middle, and that had a 5-meter in diameter light that was like a sun, and it bathed them in life-giving frequencies. And also that it wasn't the only place that was submerged, because this is what happened. And the Syrians picked it up when one of the sphinxes was completely submerged, and they picked the one that was only halfway. And that's why you have the water erosion. Apparently it's not rain, but it's just the Nile. And it wasn't the only such place that submerged. And Japan also is the explanation for their underwater pyramids as well. And also, Helanas, just because it dismantled doesn't mean that it was violent. It's simply the fact that the ENLs overcame the need for the physical, so they just upgraded to etheric. And then it also quickly mentions that Troy was the last outpost of the Hyperboreans because it guarded in the center of it a huge portal to 4D. And that's why we only have a few remnants of it today. And also that the Mayans, you have very little traces of them because they too retreated when they were attempted to be conquered by the Spaniards. And they created a huge portal, and the Spaniards were blind to it. It was very powerful, and they weren't quite ready, all of them. So the priests gave the other ones a kind of vibrational jump. And due to the psychological blindness that the Spaniards had to it, they managed to more or less make a successful escape to Hollow Earth, the Mayans. And I don't know if it's to El Dorado, but possibly. So anyway, because of this affinity that they had to it, it was enough. And at the end, the priests went in. And also, the book ends with this idea that the Anunnaki, it's a mistake to call all of them by this name, because you have many sects and many offshoots, and some of them are well aligned and others are not. But the ones that made us in the first place, they are very highly regarded, and they are who saw the potential in us and who, woke us up from the stupor, and were very sacrificial as well. And you have, it's also mentioned quickly that you have the divergence of the gods that also involved Anunnaki about 5,000 years ago, and that they left an elite class in charge. And of course, these are, in my reading between the lines, these were the Orion's Belt Anunnaki that are also known to be a little harsh in some of the SSP's accounts. But at any rate, the very last thing in the book is that the whole creation of humanity, actually, the reason why it was, instigated by these celestial subtle entities was that there is a galactic wedding that is primed by them that comes from the causal plane. And the reason behind it is that the Milky Way galaxy is about to join the Andromeda galaxy. Of course, we're talking millions of years at least in the future. And it's not like you will have planets joining, but you will have the sets of stars and planets that will agglomerate. And this is why it's important that you bring them to a sort of affinity or, resonance. And because if you don't, then you'll have to pay the price. And this is why the effort to create humanity, was started. And because apparently we will play a major role in the distant future. And also, my last question regarding this book to you is, I hear from a certain SSP account that the ETs that collaborated to create us, while they were extremely important in the first hundreds of thousands of years, as of late, we made so-called new friends, which bring us technology faster and make pacts that are, more liberal. And do you know if that, would you agree with this statement?
Well, I mean, if we go to the 1940s, 50s, there were the Greada Treaty. So the governments, the US government and some others, they worked with reptilians and greys, which gave us advanced anti-grav tech in exchange for abducting humans, hybridizing humans, collecting DNA. So that certainly speeded up the process. And the crashes, the UFO crashes, those were engineered. Roswell, that was done on purpose to crash the UFOs. So the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the retrieval teams, and Lockheed Martin and all of those sort of black ops operations, they get pieces of everything and reverse engineer it. And we have the TR-3Bs, the TR-6s, the TR-10s that is now being used by Space Force, Space Command, and the offshoots, Planetary Corp and other corporations who have affiliations with aerospace, contractors. So they have affiliations with them. So this is, ETs have long been involved in giving us some technology. The Aldebaran Anunnaki, Maria Orsage, depending on how you say it, yeah. They influenced her. They gave her the Honeyboo, the saucer craft type of schematics in Sumerian, which, you know, who got a hold of them, we'll just say the H guy and the N organization, but they couldn't misuse it for the wrong reasons, so they did not win the war. And Maria Orsich left the planet because she was a galactic being. She was not born here originally, but she was to help humanity advance with technology, propulsion systems, anti-gravity, zero-point tech. But unfortunately, because of the interferences, that didn't go as planned. So this is kind of the nutshell. But can you talk a little bit about India? What was Vishnu, Krishna, Brahma, the blue beings? What are their origins? Does this book talk about that? Where they came from?
No, actually, no. It glosses over some of the languages on the Vimanas, but that's in book 7. It's just a few details, and it says that they're linked with the Pleiadians.
Okay.
But that's about it. It doesn't have the room. So
okay. So do you want to do book 7 today or another time? Because
I thought it through, and I think the best thing to do is to do half of book 7 now, and then maybe when the 8th book launches, because it's due, you know, any month, then we can maybe pick those up.
I would love to do book 7 all together, though, not do things in half. So maybe also schedule another session to do book 7.
I'm down, of course.
Okay.
It's a huge, very meaty book.
Yeah, I think we should do it on its own, make it stand out on its own.
Sure, if you want. Yeah, I agree that I'm sure that realistically speaking, this would take like another hour plus. So I think you're right.
Yeah, I think because we've gone so in depth about book 6, so we will definitely pick it up next time for book 7, because I don't want to be depending on book 8. It's coming any day. What if it doesn't? Let's make book 7 just stand out on its own. And then when book 8 comes out and it's out, you know, you have a chance to read, we'll cover book 8 then when it comes out. I'm a person of stay in the now, stay in the present, be current. So book 7, we'll do another date.
Agreed. And actually, it's the book that combines pretty much all 6 into one. So you have the Akashic history regarding the moon in this case. You have the visits in the tunnels, the advanced technology, and stuff about alchemy. And you finally get to hear from Eleanor again for the first time in a long time.
Excellent. So we'll cover those highlights in book 7 at another time. So thank you so much, Daniel. I appreciate you sharing your wisdom and knowledge about Radu Cinamar's books. Amazing. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for your input.
Have a good day. Bye.